Susan is from University College in Dublin, and she will be speaking on the moral quandary of helping without harm, the promise and problem of assistance. Next, we will hear from University of Utah Professor of Sociology Andrew Jorgenson, and he will speak on an unequal world with unequal consequences, the relationship between public health, climate change, and globalization. Then, as a discussant, we will hear from Fred Gottlieb, who is a medical doctor here at the University of Utah. The structure of the panel discussion will be about 25 minutes each for Susan first and then Andrew, and we'll have about 10 minutes or so for Fred, which should leave about 20 or 25 minutes for open discussion. Susan?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being here at 9 o'clock this morning. I'm delighted to see such a good crowd. Firstly, let me say how deeply honoured I am to be here. I received this invitation from Professor Chatterjee about 4 weeks before I submitted my doctoral dissertation. And I was in what can only be described as the valley of despair. I was absolutely convinced I had nothing to say, I had no argument to make, and what am I doing here anyway? And I have to say that that invitation really was like a light shining across the Atlantic Ocean into my tiny little cave. And I was greatly inspired. So it means an awful lot to me to be here today. I'm incredibly grateful to Professor Chatterjee for the invitation and to the conference sponsors for allowing me to participate, and also to all of the organisers who have been tremendous.
Let's just adjust this. That'll be much better.
Great. So they're all of my thank yous. I hope those were communicated across the room and everybody heard quite clearly. I do speak a little bit quickly, so I have to try and force myself to slow down. So if anybody just kind of puts their hand down like this from the audience to suggest slow it down, then I will follow suit. I fully accept I have a very heavy Irish accent, so it's an unavoidable fact, I think, of living in that country.
I don't know if people in the back can hear you.
Can you hear me back there, Victoria? Yeah? Okay. So to get started this morning, the focus of this paper is really to examine a particular problem in the international assistance industry. So I'm not going to look, I'm looking at this specific problem, and it's quite a narrow focus on this particular problem within the current contemporary practices of assistance. So I'm examining a moral quandary facing actors within the international assistance industry, so really practitioners within that industry, and also then agents who support that industry. So taxpayers who contribute tax dollars that go into OECD, DAC, which is the Development Assistance Committee for Overseas Aid, and also then through charitable donations. So the question, or one of the challenges I think that they face, is how to assist without causing harm. Now, to give you some idea of the methodology that I'm going to employ here this morning, I follow one of Christine Korsgaard's best rules of philosophical methodology, which is that a clear statement of the problem is also a statement of the solution. So I'm going to begin with an examination of the practical problem, and to do that I'm going to draw upon the empirical literature on disaster and development, which really is the source for my understanding of this particular practical problem, whereby active assistance can cause harms, albeit unintended harms, but can cause harms to recipient populations. I'm then going to examine some of the underlying philosophical dimensions of this problem, because it is a practical problem, and I think that there is some work to demonstrate how this practical problem also has philosophical implications that a political theorist such as myself can contribute to, because I'm not best placed to contribute to questions on logistics and coordination, but hopefully can contribute to perhaps a clarification of some of the underlying problems and dimensions of this particular problem. So I'm going to examine then two philosophical applications of the duty of assistance, which they take to be the underlying moral duty requiring agents to act to help others when they're in need of assistance in the light of this particular problem. Okay? So I recognise that there are There is an enormous philosophical debate as to whether we have a duty of assistance or not. I am going to bracket that debate. I'm going to work on the assumption that I'm working with literature that takes it that we do have a duty of assistance. And I'm going to examine some of the challenges in the practice of that duty and the fulfillment of that duty. So to look at a little bit at the context within which this practice takes place. So everybody, I think, in the room is very aware that for every second of every day, there's someone somewhere experiencing severe harm and suffering. And for the first time in the history of humanity, we can know this and we can witness this directly. And we do know this and we do witness this directly. And it is widely accepted by governments and citizens in all states that we ought to help others who are in need of assistance and who are in life-threatening situations. And in response to this, practices of assistance have evolved and expanded over the centuries to facilitate between those in desperate need and those with the capacity to assist. It operates at a global level and it delivers assistance wherever and whenever the need is most pressing. So, for example, there's currently a target amongst OECD states to contribute 0.7% of gross national income towards the Development Assistance Committee for Overseas Aid. And then also there are enormous contributions made by individual citizens every day to charitable organisations. So assistance and the practices of assistance are funded by individual agents, individual human beings across all countries. And we can see, for example, the international response to the earthquake in Haiti, whereby there was enormous amounts and enormous donations delivered to assist people in dire and life-threatening situations in that particular context. Or indeed, last summer, in response to the unfolding of the famine in the Horn of Africa, again, there was substantial international response and effort to try and figure out ways of delivering assistance to people in that situation. Assistance here means very, very broadly. I mean, I'm assuming that assistance is part and parcel of the material and social fabric of finite lives, that every human being at some particular point in their lives requires assistance from another. So I suppose I intend this to mean that it is acknowledging another's status as a human being and acting for their benefit or in their interest at some point in their life. So it's a very broad idea, I think, that I'm working with here. So to look a little bit more closely at the practical problem, so drawing upon the literature, the empirical literature on disaster and development, there's a number of analysts within this literature who have argued that the practice of assistance is in a state of crisis. Now, according to the literatures that I've worked with, there are two dominant approaches to how it is we go about fulfilling upon the duty to assist. A deontological or a duty-based approach and consequentialist or outcome-based approach. Now, firstly, let me apologise for those terms. I think that they're very difficult and cumbersome terms, and I'm really not sure that they actually communicate too much. But generally speaking, there are those who will act because, according to principles, and there are those who will act to try and achieve the best outcomes. And they are the way in which people will reason. So, according to some of these analysts and observers, and I'm drawing here upon the work of Michael Barnett and Thomas Weiss, drawing upon a particular debate from the journal Ethics and International Affairs back in 1999, where there was an enormous discussion around the possibility of harm and the sense of crisis within the assistance industry. And it seems to be that if practitioners act according to a particular code of principles, so for example, those principles might be the principles of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, that these actions can and do result in harms, albeit unintended harms. And it also seems to be that if, on the other hand, if actors act to achieve particular outcomes, again, actions may result more in harm than in good. In some circumstances, not in all circumstances. So it seems to be that, simply put, those involved in this industry are experiencing a difficult time in determining what is the right thing to do to help those in need of assistance. This is very much an evidence-based claim, and I should specify that this is an evidence-based claim, and there is an enormous debate as to what activities help and what activities potentially cause harm. But it seems to be that there's an underlying sense of unease and almost a sense of crisis within that industry. that I think requires some reflection, it requires a spotlight and some consideration to figure out ways in which we can do this perhaps better, more effectively. So it does prompt, I suppose, one of the first questions that it prompts, and it's a fairly obvious question, is why is this happening? And I'd like to suggest that an examination of the empirical literature, it points to 3 trends, and there's quite an amount of consensus on these particular trends and events that indicate the source of this sense of unease. Firstly, the complexity of the event types that fall in, that the complexity of event types and the circumstances within which people actually find themselves in need of assistance. Secondly, the multiplicity of event types and the growing numbers of event types. And then finally, uncertainty regarding the outcomes of probable acts of assistance. So if we think a little bit about the complexity of event types, and if we think, for example, about humanitarian emergencies, I think that it's possible to identify at least 3 different types or categories of events that fall into this one term, humanitarian emergency. So, for example, there will be natural shocks. Now, natural shocks, everybody's exposed to, anybody can experience a natural shock as a consequence of increased weather precipitation, earthquakes, cyclones, etc. There's also then what we might refer to as natural disasters. Now, the difference between a shock and a disaster is that disasters typically tend to affect the most vulnerable disproportionately. So, for example, I'm drawing here upon the work of Amartya Sen on famine, and I'm also drawing on some of the UN work on disaster risk and reduction, whereby they argue that bad planning and a lack of consideration for the needs of the most vulnerable within communities results in those groups being the most and worst affected when a shock of some description occurs. So, for example, the UN ISDN report, it identifies a number of different reasons as to why a disaster might occur. So, for example, it identifies increasing urbanization, increases the risk of exposure to a disaster, poor urban governance, predominantly in developing states, poor urban governance, vulnerable rural livelihoods, and declining ecosystems. Each of these factors contribute towards the likelihood of harm occurring. So just to kind of, I suppose, take an example, if we think of a tropical cyclone, and if we think of a country such as Japan and the Philippines, which typically have similar exposure to tropical cyclones of equal magnitude, a person in Japan or a person in the Philippines is 17 times more likely to die than a person in Japan because of, better planning, better local governance, better infrastructure that's currently in place in Japan than in the Philippines. So there is a real, there is a real difference in how a natural shock, such as a cyclone, will affect particular groups based upon their exposure to severe poverty. Then secondly, multiplicity. Multiplicity of events, the third type of events that might fall into the term humanitarian emergencies are complex humanitarian emergencies. So complex humanitarian emergencies typically entail conflict. So they will typically entail intentional disruption and perhaps the creation of circumstances within an environment whereby an emergency occurs that will result in some form of social, political and economic change. So here we're thinking very much of some of the conflicts that have been occurring, say, in recent years, for example, in Somalia, in Sudan, and in a combination of different places. So if we look at those types of events, you've got a real mixture of different types of events, and we have one broad category and one broad response to how it is that we currently deal with those types of events. So if we look then at multiplicity, I've made the claim that this is increasing, and it's an increasing problem and more people are exposed to this. So again, this is an evidence-based claim. So if we look at the period from 1945 to 1988, according to the UNDP, the UN were involved in about 13 different peacekeeping activities in areas that were experiencing a complex humanitarian emergency. If we look at the period from 1988 up to 1995, that number increased to 40. And if you look at the UNDP reports for today, there's about 45 different conflicts taking place. So there has been enormous pressure, enormous activity, and most of which has really erupted, I suppose, since the end of the Cold War. Since the end of the Cold War period, or at least this is what the literature suggests, that period marked a defining moment and a shift and a change in the types of emergencies and the numbers affected by these emergencies. And it's also, I think, clear that some areas experience overlapping and recurring emergencies. And one of the most troubling features is that areas that have been the focus of development assistance, for example, such as Chad and Sudan, also are areas that experience these recurring and overlapping emergencies. So, for example, if you look at the potential of famine in the Horn of Africa, I don't know about you, but I remember the pictures of the famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s, and then I look at the pictures again today of that same region and the same risks affecting the same communities. And it's important to ask, well, why is this happening? And why didn't my help at that point in time ensure that this didn't happen again? Why is it that these same communities are still exposed in that way? And the final feature that I'd suggest is evident in the literature is that there is uncertainty regarding the probable outcomes of acts of assistance. There is strong disagreement amongst the observers, amongst the practitioners, as to what types of assistance actually work. And it may be found that some types and some actions work in some locations that don't work in other locations, and there's a lot of contestation. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we stop contributing to assistance, but I think that some consideration needs to be given to how it is those acts of assistance are selected for the particular problems, and how we might select more appropriately for the particular context of need. So I'm drawing here on a definition provided by Sven Ove Hansen, who argues that uncertainty exists when the conditions of uncertainty exist when the probability of outcome is either partially or fully unknown. So to move on to some of the implications of that, I would argue that this is not just a problem of logistics and coordination, and I think that feeling or that claim is supported somewhat by Cornelio Samaruga, for example, from the ICRC, who argues that for some years now, and this is sure to be the case for some to come, we've been living in a state of uncertainty with a dearth of political and ethical references at various levels, both national and international. And it points to, I would suggest, a number of different underlying philosophical dimensions that do require some consideration. These are moral dimensions, epistemic dimensions, and practical dimensions. And these philosophical dimensions have a normative bearing on considerations of who ought to do what for whom when the need for assistance arises. So if we look at the moral dimensions, I've probably overcomplicated this a little bit by drawing upon Barbara Herman's description of the problem of social pluralism. But really the idea here is that both donors and recipients are based within bounded groups. They're based within groups that are bound by special affiliations, by special duties and responsibilities. And that in itself can be a challenge to the reach of universal moral requirements. Okay, so if we say we have a duty to assist across those groups, we are situated within those groups and we are assisting others who are situated in other groups. And I would suggest that gives rise to at least three distinct considerations. Firstly, recognition of the fact that assistance is a form of interference in those groups, and that interference as such can have intended outcomes and consequences and unintended outcomes and consequences. Secondly, recognition to the membership of the groups, both of the donors and of the recipients, and of their existing set and their network of special relationships and special duties, and how it is they would negotiate and work between these special requirements and a general duty to assist others in life-threatening situation. So I think that those factors, assistance being a form of interference, membership of groups, and also then the situated context of agents, they have some normative bearing when thinking about who ought to do what for whom when the need for assistance arises. Now I have to say that there is radically different perspectives within the literature on the moral significance of boundaries. So special relationships and ties and connections, they reflect the richness and the diversity and the plurality of individual agents' lives. Now, whether these boundaries set moral constraints on the types and the forms of duty between strangers is greatly contested. However, it is widely accepted that most agents are situated within a complex network of affiliations and engage in reasoning and deliberation from within this situated context. So there's strong disagreement on many levels, and perhaps including the most basic question, which is the duty of assistance owed to all persons equally, or to some human beings, those inside of a group, or do we owe more to those inside of our group than to those outside of our group? So are we duty-bound always to meet the needs of those that we share some form of special affiliation or connection with, Or are we duty-bound to consider more broadly the absolute needs of others and those who may be in more desperate circumstances? I suggest also that there have been at least 3 different epistemic shifts which influence this debate and which also have a normative bearing on the questions of this. So firstly, I suggest, and again, I don't think that this is anything new or particularly enlightening, but modern communications and technology have led to a much deeper awareness of the needs of others. It's very difficult now to ignore the needs of others beyond boundaries and borders and special relationships. There's also greater understanding of the complexity of the nature of emergencies. So it may not simply be a case of giving food or giving money, but there may be additional requirements in order to meet those needs and to protect against future harms. And then there also seems to be a deeper understanding of the connections to others through our dramatically wider economic interactions and also interconnections. And by interconnections here, I mean, again, a very broad idea, but we share one planet. So the activities of one group in one location will and may have an effect on those in another location, perhaps at another time. It's quite difficult, I think, to think about the link of connections and interconnections, other than to recognise that we do share one space, and that what we do in one space may have an effect on others. So if we think, for example, of activities that took place in Brazil in the 1970s in the rainforests, where Brazil was doing what states do, what responsible states do. They were clearing areas for agricultural production, and it soon became clear to scientists that this is problematical, that this is having an effect. Yeah?
5 minutes.
Okay. That this is having an effect on the environment, and that the rainforests are effectively the lungs of the earth, and we need them protected. So Brazil, at that point in time, was required, through international pressure, to pull back from that activity, to think about others beyond their borders, and to think about their interconnections with those others. And finally, then, I'm going to move on a little bit more quickly than I had hoped, but if I move on to practical dimensions, I think that the practical problem that I've referred to a little bit earlier also has some normative implications. Firstly, I suggest that if outcomes cannot be achieved with any level of certainty, then outcomes can be used to guide the selection of, outcomes be used to guide in the selection of act types and courses of action in the practice of assistance? And secondly, uncertainty on the probable outcomes of actions gives rise to a particular problem relating to the issue of harm. So how do agents determine which courses of action to undertake without, when helping another without causing harm? Or what do they do if they cause unintended harm? So I knew I wouldn't get to the end of my presentation because I'm afraid I'm really not good at timekeeping in that sense. So I decided to shift my basic argument forward and just give you a picture of what it is that I think, that I'm hoping to argue here. So I'm working on the assumption that I have a basic problem, which is that acting to assist others within contemporary circumstances of assistance raises the potential of harm. And I examine in what follows 2 accounts drawn from 2 of the leading political philosophers within the areas of global justice and international ethics, Peter Singer's narrow approach and Amartya Sen's broad consequentialist approach. And I will argue that the narrow accounts of the duty of assistance that seek to secure this duty through the precise specification of act types, such as giving certain amounts of money to charity, have difficulty resolving this quandary. And I further argue that a broad approach, which seeks to avoid very strict prescriptions outside of the particular context of need and draws instead on the idea of responsible agency and practical reasoning, 2 terms that will take a little bit of time to work through, but we'll see how far we get. These elements are requirements for the expression of this duty, and they provide a more secure basis for action whilst avoiding harm, or indeed identifying what levels of harm are permissible within the contemporary context. So I've been a little bit bold here and probably exposed myself to enormous criticism, but I'm going to suggest that there are at least 6 different elements to the idea of a duty of assistance that you will find across a broad spectrum of philosophical traditions. Not all, but certainly across a broad spectrum. Firstly, and I'm drawing here on the ideas of Kant, of Sidgwick, of John Rawls, of Peter Singer, of John Stuart Mill, and a combination of others. So assistance within these traditions is a matter of strict obligation. Okay, it is a duty. That is a matter of strict obligation. It's something that we ought to do. Secondly, it's positive. It requires agents to undertake specific actions. Thirdly, it's general or universal in scope, but it's imperfect and context dependent. So it's incomplete, indeterminate, and of wide application. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, quite simply, it's not possible to help everybody all of the time. So agents need to select who they can help and how they can help and in what circumstances they can help. This duty is, within these accounts, the duty is ends-based. So actions required by the duty are means towards particular ends. So it may be reducing suffering and harm, or it may be improving the conditions of well-being, whereby agents can actually live lives that can be of value to them. And actions arising from this duty are particular and selective. And finally, that the duty is constrained by a duty not to harm. And again, that's evident across the philosophical tradition, that harm is a constraint. Now, the nature of that constraint is contested within the tradition, but it is recognised that when acting to assist others, there is a separate side constraint of requirement not to harm. So, if I look very, very briefly at Singer's prescriptive consequentialism, Singer takes a classical, what would be described as a classical utilitarian approach. And he argues, it's a very simple and beautifully constructed argument that has been the source of much debate and discussion over the last 30 years. And he wrote this piece he originally put this argument forward in 1971, I think, or perhaps 72, in response to a disaster which was unfolding in East Bengal. And here he argued that, he starts from a basic premise that all human beings share equal moral status, that suffering and harm is bad, that suffering and harm that is avoidable and reducible is morally unacceptable, and that each agent has a duty to prevent this bad from occurring without sacrificing anything of equal moral worth. And from this, he would argue in his later work, so in 2009, he concluded that as donations to aid agencies prevent suffering and harm and do not sacrifice anything of equal moral worth, it is morally wrong and blameworthy not to donate aid to aid agencies. He employs a particular method of abstraction, deduction, and application to determine what the right thing to do is to help those in need of assistance. So he asks people to think about a particular hypothetical scenario. He moves then from the abstract utilitarian principles, whereby we will aim at the end of reducing harm and suffering for the greatest numbers. And then he applies this. So if one can help another avoid serious harm without sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth, then one ought to do so. Now, I would argue that there are a number of different challenges with this particular approach, and I'm not going to rehearse the wider challenges that have been examined across the literature. Anybody who's interested can go and examine the charges of over-demandingness, etc., of that particular piece. But I'd like to draw your attention to what I think are some problematical areas of this particular prescription. And I'm going to jump straight to the question of interference and the risk of harm, or to the issue of interference and the risk of harm. And I'm going to suggest a charge of under-demandingness. And you may firmly disagree with this, but when I hear about Singer's particular scenarios, so for example, you have a drowning child, you have a passing stranger, should a stranger step in and save that child? And most people's reaction is, yes, of course they should. But I ask the question, well, what happens to that child afterwards? So my actions have saved that child from that particular harm. Do I then return the child to an incompetent or perhaps negligent guardian, or do I, contact, say, social services and ask for assistance with that child and therefore interfere further? And my actions expose that child to all of these potentials, risks and harms. So what I'm suggesting is that Singer's prescription, they represent or point to the beginning of a process of engagement in a special relationship rather than the complete fulfillment of a moral obligation. And on that basis, I suggest that the conclusion that he reaches is somewhat under-demanding of us. Secondly, if we look then at the Singer's particular approach and the epistemic shift, so can I meet all of the requirements? I would ask the question again, okay, we know about the complexity, we know about the numbers of those experiencing harm and suffering, and we also know that some of the actions that we take can result in further harms and suffering. And I would really ask the question, well, can I meet all of the requirements of this duty by simply giving enough money to somebody else to sort the problem out? Or does my action of giving actually create additional duties and responsibilities whereby I must take responsibility for the outcome of those actions? So is the right action to take from a utilitarian perspective that would lead to the best outcomes? Would it be to sustain the current existing institutional framework as it is? I fully acknowledge and agree with Singer that this is necessary action because it does save lives and it's the best available option to us today. However, I would suggest that perhaps it's not sufficient. And then from a practical perspective, I think that Singer is also somewhat challenged in that if outcomes cannot be determined or secured with any level of certainty, then can outcomes such as increased well-being or reduced harm determine the right course of action? And that is, that's a question I'm not going to try and answer here, but I think it's a question that I'm not sure that Singer provides us with a very strong response to. And secondly, then how do we balance trade-offs within this particular account? So what harms could be permitted? What level of harms? And how do we determine what levels of harms are likely? Using the particular framework for practical reasoning, so abstraction, deduction and application that Singer talks about. And I'm suggesting really that he provides us with weak answers to these particular questions. I would strongly argue that Singer is very aware of these difficulties and much of his later work is focused in on addressing some of these. But his conclusion seems to me to be that in the absence of any other viable alternatives, that we still should continue to support the international institutional framework and then seek ways in which we can improve that perhaps from the inside. So I'd like to turn to Sen's approach, of 1 minute left, and I would like to just suggest that Sen's approach is somewhat more suitable or provides us with a framework for thinking about the particular problem that might help guide agents through and might enable us continue to act to assist others whilst giving consideration to the potential for harm and perhaps mitigating against those harms. So I'm going to pass through this page, which is Sen's particular critique of Singer's account. I'm very happy to send this on to anybody who'd like to read it afterwards. Or the full paper, which might be a little bit more helpful. But I'm going to suggest that within Sen's broad consequentialism, there's at least 3 ways within which agents can come to have duties. Sen is predominantly known for his work on justice. However, he has an awful lot to say about the idea of assistance and the duty of assistance. Within his account, there are at least 3 different ways in which a person can come to have a duty. Firstly, he would argue that duties are correlatives of human rights. Secondly, he would argue that duties are derived through the reach of action and Sen's particular account of agency and freedom. Now, I could probably spend the entire time talking about this particular second point, but to try and make this as accessible as possible, Sen would argue that when we act and when we choose particular types of actions, we are responsible for the outcomes of those actions, whatever those outcomes are. So the reach of our action crosses boundaries, and with that, then, the obligation or the responsibility for those actions may cross those boundaries. So he would argue that the freedom to act in that way, the ability to make choices and decisions and choose which types of acts to take, carries with it, then, the responsibility for the outcomes and is a source of duties and obligations. And thirdly, he argues that duties can arise indirectly. So he would argue that, for example, the duty of assistance is a third-party obligation. So in a circumstance where a right holder, for example, cannot have a right fulfilled or perhaps have the rights violated by others, that those with the capacity to assist ought to do so or have a duty to act. So, bearing in mind that I'm just about out of time, let me see. So I think that to move on to a very quick examination of Sen's, an application of Sen's account, examining this within the moral dimensions, within the moral framework that we were talking about, I would suggest that his account, rather than abstracting from situated circumstances, he situates agents within their particular contexts, okay, within their networks of links and relationships. And he calls upon agents to reason from that point and to take responsibilities of their actions from that point. So agents are required to consider those affected through the reach of their actions and responsibility for those outcomes. He assumes that agents are situated, so he doesn't assume that they're going to abstract themselves from their contemporary circumstances. His is essentially a non-ideal account of how we can go about practical reasoning. And he argues then that it's context-sensitive and also consequence-sensitive. So it's sensitive to the context within which a decision maker is based and also sensitive to the outcomes of the particular actions that they choose. So in a sense, it kind of begins with a situated agent and then moves outward from that particular point. And I would suggest that Sen avoids the risk of harm, by and large, through the blend of the way in which people can come to have duties. So the reach of action and the openness of moral requirements mark the beginning of a relationship, of a special relationship rather than the complete end of moral action in this particular circumstance. In terms of the epistemic dimensions, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, other than to say that Sten's work has really been instrumental in creating some of that awareness about the complexity of humanitarian emergencies in particular, and about some of the challenges facing those within the assistance industry. So rather than trying to deal with these epistemic conditions, he's very much contributed to creating that awareness and to creating that knowledge. And he argues that a person who is in need of assistance can claim or demand, as a matter of right, either directly or indirectly, that those with the capacity to do so ought to assist. And in terms of the practical applications, well, this is quite a technical piece. So how does he avoid the charge? How does he avoid some of the challenges that Singer faced, for example? Well, he avoids those really by, he doesn't expect the impossible. He moves from a basis of ought implies can. So he argues that we need to engage in a process of comparative partial ranking. So based upon the available information, we make the best choice available to us with the information that we have at hand. So he doesn't seek to find, a final, infallible, particular prescriptive course of actions. Rather, he suggests that the actions that we take are fallible, they may carry unintended consequences, and we then have responsibilities to follow through from that point. So he argues that he seeks to maximize rather than to optimize. He doesn't expect agents to abstract or deduct very specific prescriptive rules, rather than to consider their circumstances, to make a judgment, an evaluation on the best available information, and to move from that basis. So what are the implications of this, very briefly, for the practical problem that we introduced at the beginning?
Can you wrap it up?
Yep, this is the last one. So firstly, I would suggest that the existing international framework is a mediating structure that facilitates agents to perform the duty and reach those that they're connected to. But I'd argue that agents supporting this mediating structure are responsible for the outcomes and the actions of this structure. So if you contribute funds through foreign aid, through charitable organisations, you're not removed from the outcomes of the actions of those particular groups. We are still responsible for the outcomes of the actions of those particular groups. So I would argue that agents ought to demand and ought to be able to engage in public deliberation on and appraisal of the performance of these institutions, of their goals, of their ends, and of the particular outcomes of their actions, so to really see the good, the bad and the ugly, and to help us understand what it is we've supported. And I would argue that if institutions fail to perform this duty or cause avoidable harm in the performance of this duty, then agents ought to act to address this. So, for example, this may entail removing funding and support and diverting it to more appropriate institutions, or institutions that can demonstrate, perhaps, that they can give consideration to the particular context and enable agents to act whilst minimising harms upon the recipient community. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sorry it was so rushed, but it really was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Next we'll hear from Andrew Jorgenson on global climate change. Andrew?
Oh, good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today, and I also wanted to quickly thank my colleagues at the university here for inviting me to participate. This has been a wonderful event. I regret I wasn't able to be here too much for the prior panels so far. I'm the new director of graduate studies for our PhD program, and we just sent out all of our offers to new students yesterday, so I've been dealing with that. Those of you in our profession, I'm sure, can relate to that. Anyway, so what I'm going to do today, do I need the mic? Okay, all right. Oh, I apologize, okay. Okay, I'll try not to speak too loudly. So actually what I'm going to do today, I'm typical bait and switch. So I'm actually going to, as you can see, the title of my talk is a bit different from what is in the program, because I recognize I realistically can't within 20 minutes or so talk about both the public health impacts of climate change as well as the human drivers of climate change. It's just impossible to do that in 20 minutes. So instead, I'm going to spend a little while and kind of give you an overview of some of the empirical work that I and my colleagues have been doing, focusing on some of the broad human drivers of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, focusing on the effects of economic development, militarization, which is greatly overlooked in areas of research, as well as particular types of economic globalization. So just to give you an outline of where I'm going quite quickly, because I do want to get through this quickly so we can have time for discussion. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. I'm going to begin by briefly talking about what I refer to as resource consumption and underconsumption patterns kind of cross-nationally, which has a lot of public health implications and is directly tied to notions of climate change. I'm going to talk about this paradox and so on, and relevance for climate change. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to show you some pictures, some slides looking at sort of trends of CO2 emissions and economic development through time for wealthier nations and poorer nations. Then I'll move on, and I'm going to talk about a couple of theoretical perspectives within that are really sort of grounded in my discipline. Two treadmill theories, treadmill production theory and treadmill destruction theory. I didn't coin the terms. I think they're quite catchy, though. So I'll describe both of these perspectives briefly to you, and then I'm going to sort of give you a sense of how we go about empirically testing these theories and show you some results so you can get a sense of how generalizable these theories are and how they help us really understand more broadly what's going on in the contemporary world. Then I'll talk a bit about particular types of economic globalization and what is commonly referred to as environmental load displacement. And I'll talk about two related theories and how they're tested empirically, and then I'll provide you a couple of take-home points. Okay. So let me very quickly tell you what this slide is showing. Okay, so this is actually a series of what we refer to as box plots, and it's a very simple descriptive tool. So you can see here, this is actually looking at the ecological footprints of 69 nations from 1960 to 2003 at 5-year time points from 1960 up through 2000, and then jumping to 2003. Simply, we just didn't have data to go any further when we started doing this project. And this sort of 0 point here on the particular axis is referred to as a globally sustainable threshold of per capita resource consumption. And so at each of these time points, this is actually giving you the distribution of the 69 nations in terms of their per capita ecological footprint relative to this globally sustainable threshold. So you can see a couple of clear things here, I think. First of all, you can see through time there's an upward trend, where the majority of these nations within the sample go from having globally sustainable resource consumption levels per person to globally unsustainable levels of resource consumption. And this is looking at national level per capita ecological footprints. I'm sure a lot of you have probably gotten online before and calculated your own footprint, and you felt like a loser because you were told that there would need to be 7 or 8 worlds if everyone in the world consumed as many resources as you did. But we actually do have rather valuable data available for the ecological footprints of nations, which allow for all sorts of hypothesis testing and so on. So you can see that through time, most nations have gone from having sustainable levels of resource consumption to unsustainable levels. And from my point of view, typically from a sustainability perspective, we focus on those at the upper end of the distribution, those that overconsume. But from a human well-being perspective, it's absolutely critical also to recognize what's going on with nations in the world that have resource consumption levels well below a globally sustainable threshold. Fundamentally, this is tied to just survival. We're talking about the least economically developed nations, and we're really talking about just day-to-day survival, just having access to enough calories, having access to materials for basic housing and infrastructure and so on. And to really hit this point home, if you just look at the relationship between economic development and the ecological footprints of nations, this is just a scatter plot. Just looking at the relationship between development and per capita footprints, you can see they're very highly correlated. There's a clear pattern here. So we're really talking about more broadly an affluence consumption and underconsumption type of relationship. Now you might be wondering, okay, so what's the deal? Why is he talking about this? I thought he was going to talk about climate change. Well, we can also look at sort of more broadly, this is a sociologist's lame attempt at making a map. And I apologize, I'm not a geographer. But anyway, if we look kind of globally at patterns of resource consumption levels related to domestic levels of environmental degradation, we can see these patterns of consumption degradation sorts of paradoxes. So this is actually showing you the relationship, a simplified version of this, of the relationship, sort of the pattern between per capita ecological footprints and rates of deforestation within the borders of nations. And simply what we see is nations with higher footprints that consume more resources tend to have lower levels of deforestation within their borders. Many of those high-consuming nations like the US, we actually are experiencing reforestation or afforestation, which is a complex process. But nonetheless, though, this is just an example of these sorts of patterns, and so you might ask, well, are these somehow interrelated? And I'll get to that in a little while. Now, one of the reasons why I think deforestation is an important environmental outcome to consider is, well, because of carbon sequestration, which is something that hopefully you're familiar with. So in the context of thinking about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, this is kind of a serious problem as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about carbon dioxide emissions. So a simple slide here, what this is doing, this is actually showing you the time trends for 22 developed countries and 64 less developed countries, simply just adding up their total CO2 emissions, anthropogenic emissions at each time point. And this line here represents data for 22 developed countries, and this line here represents data for 64 less developed countries. And you can see a pattern here. You can see a pattern of convergence. You can see that through time that these 64 LDCs combined, that their total CO2 emissions are approaching a level sort of at the same level as 22 developed countries. Now this sort of hides something though that some of you are probably familiar with. This upward trend for LDCs is largely driven by China and to some extent India. In fact, if we take China and India out of this data set right here, this line actually remains relatively flat. And in 2005, China accounted for almost 53% of this sum right here. And India accounted for 11.5%. Okay. Now, the United States accounts for a non-trivial amount of total emissions for these developed countries as well. I want to get back to this because this is tied to population dynamics clearly, and this is something that's sort of part of the theme of this panel. But what I really want to focus on, though, is per capita emissions given from an international inequality perspective. This is a more theoretically appropriate measure to consider. And if we look at per capita emissions for the same nations through time, looking at the same sort of time trend, we do not see convergence. In fact, we see divergence. We see that in general, through time, per capita emissions for developed countries have been going up. It's not a perfect linear trend. There's some cycles going on. Whereas for less developed countries, there's a slight increase, and these are just measures of central tendency. There's a lot of variability for sure. But you can definitely see that through time, there is not a pattern of convergence. There's a pattern of divergence. And as a sociologist who studies forms of international and global inequality, I consider this to be theoretically very interesting with a lot of implications. Now, if we then move on and look at the same time trend for levels of economic development, we see somewhat of a similar set of dynamics here. This is just looking at per capita GDP through time for the same nations, and we see the same kind of divergent pattern. Now what this does, though, is this hides the fact that for developing nations or less developed countries, they are to some extent experiencing economic development. It's not that they're experiencing the opposite of development. It doesn't suggest that their GDP per capita is actually going down. There is some evidence of an increase of economic development, but you can clearly see that there's this kind of growing development gap, which I think has sort of been discussed in various ways at this conference. So one might ask, are these interrelated somehow? The time trends are similar. Well, within sociology, we have a common theory known as treadmill of production theory. And whenever I talk about this theory to undergrads, I usually start pretending like I'm on a treadmill. It's hard for me not to. But it's an interesting analogy. I think it's an interesting theory. I think it makes a lot of sense when we're thinking about the relationship between economic development and economic systems and the environment in terms of inputs and outputs. So this perspective generally argues that economic systems are driven by growth on a larger, more intensive scale. So you can sort of think of development. Development speeds up. You have to throw more inputs onto that treadmill. Okay, and as the treadmill keeps going faster and faster, there's more forms of waste that fall off at the end of the treadmill. Okay, and this is sort of counterintuitive to a lot of the things that we hear about the possibility for increasing economic development to lead to sort of situations of ecological modernization. So this is really in great contrast to that form of sort of greening the economy. It's not that that is impossible. It's not that forms of technological innovations can't lead to situations of increased energy efficiency, but there's something known as the Jevons paradox that's been around for a long time that suggests that increases in energy efficiency and sort of the benefits that come along with that are outstripped by the overall environmental harms that come along with just the overall scale and intensification of production that comes along with economic development. So it's kind of a complex set of dynamics here. But if you really wanted to formalize a testable hypothesis derived from this theory, which I've attempted to do a few times, you could hypothesize that the effect of development on emissions should remain stable or actually perhaps increase in magnitude through time, regardless of countries being developed in the global north or part of the global south. Now, if we attempt to test this proposition using very fancy statistical techniques, we actually end up with some very interesting findings. So this graph here actually reports the estimated regression coefficients for the effects of economic development on per capita emissions for the same developed countries. That's the bars here, the black bars at the top here. And for the bottom, that represents the effects of economic development on per capita emissions for less developed countries, the same countries that I've been talking about up to this point. There's a lot of very interesting things. There's a lot of work that went into getting to this graph. To make a long story short, we see that through time, economic development in developed countries is simply much more carbon intensive than it is in less developed countries. This is something that we rarely ever hear about. There's this assumption that economic development in less developed countries is much more carbon intensive. That's just empirically invalid if you're looking at things this way. We see that the effect of a unit increase in GDP per capita in developed countries leads to a 0.757 unit increase in per capita emissions. In less developed countries, let's say in 2005, you can see that that effect is much smaller. But if you look at less developed countries, you do see an interesting trend through time. You see that to some extent, economic development has become a bit more carbon intensive through time, as you see with this increase in the effect of development on per capita emissions. But nonetheless, it's still much bigger in developed countries. I do want to mention, as a side note, I've been doing work on Central and Eastern European nations lately. Very interesting part of the world to try to study. And we actually see that if we do an analysis for these nations, from 1992 to 2005, we actually see that a similar pattern, a similar trend to what we see here for less developed countries, that development is becoming more carbon intensive in these transition economy nations. It's a very interesting part of the world to try to study. It's a fascinating part of the world. Everywhere's fascinating, of course. Okay, so let me quickly shift gears and talk about something that is rarely ever talked about, the environmental impacts of militarization. Not warfare per se. We talk about that all the time, as we should, without doubt. But as a sociologist that studies social institutions and social organization, we can think of militaries as social structures and consider the amount of environmental degradation that they generate regardless of whether they're engaged in armed conflicts or not. Just consider the overall size and complexity of the world's militaries. This is a rather classic quote that I put up here. You know, it's old, but I think it still sort of symbolizes I think, a reasonable point of view about national security versus environmental security. Now, this has been changing recently. You hear a lot more within the US about sort of thinking about energy security and environmental security and how that's tied to national security. But this is a rather telling quote, I think. It's circulated quite often, and I'm not going to restate it. I think it speaks for itself. But just consider more broadly the amount of natural resources that have to be consumed to maintain the overall infrastructure of the world's militaries, not just the US military, but all the world's militaries. Think of all the resources that are used for research and development. I grew up in a Lockheed household, and so this is tied to this, all these sorts of support economy dynamics that are tied to, you know, sort of the permanent war economy within the US, as well as in other nations. Just consider all the land for bases, installations, and so on. And jumping down here, because I'm talking really about CO2 emissions, the amount of fossil fuels that are consumed by the world's militaries. Tanks are not energy efficient. Humvees are not energy efficient. They're simply not. I've published multiple articles on this with the specifics where we actually do have data on such things, well, that have been provided from the US military. So broadly then, we might think that nations with relatively better funded or larger militaries are likely to consume more resources, including fossil fuels, which could contribute to growth in CO2 emissions. Now, just to sort of emphasize something here, if you look at the US military's expenditures from 1900 to 2007, and these are data that are adjusted for inflation, and these are two figures here. One is just overall US military expenditures, and the other is expenditures per soldier, which I think is a very interesting measure to look at for all sorts of reasons. I think that the trends speak for themselves, okay? I think they speak for themselves. But I'm not just talking about the US military, I'm talking about all the world's militaries. And if we estimate models where we try to look at the effects of particular military characteristics on CO2 emissions, we actually see that they do have non-trivial effects, net of the effects of development, urbanization, manufacturing, and so on. And so this is looking at the effects of two key military variables on per capita CO2 emissions for 72 countries from 1970 to 2000. And these are rather conservative estimates. I tend to use what I refer to as two-way fixed effects models in my research. Sorry, little stats geeky talk early on a Friday morning here. But you can sort of look at these bars and you can compare the magnitude of these effects. These are standardized coefficients. And so the point here is that the sort of independent effects of the world's militaries, okay, I'll wrap this up, are non-trivial. And this is just an area that we rarely neglect. We need to start thinking about the world's militaries and their environmental impacts, not just in the context of warfare, but also just as social institutions. Let me quickly, and I really mean quickly, talk about economic globalization and environmental load displacement. Very complex topic. We have ways of thinking about economic globalization and sociology from a structural perspective, which somewhat differs from other perspectives. But there are two key theories. I just want to really quickly mention them: ecologically unequal exchange theory and global production network theories. They're both interrelated. One of them, the top one, focuses on the structure of international trade. Simply, does it matter where resources are produced and where they're going? For example, if a lesser developed nation, if they export more of their commodities to more developed, higher consuming nations, does that contribute to somewhat to that increase in the in the carbon intensity of development within less developed countries? Because we know that international trade stimulates economic development. Towards the bottom, this is sort of looking at kind of the globalization of production. And we try to do this empirically by looking at the relationships between foreign investment and other sorts of things and different environmental outcomes. And we might consider this as a way of thinking about how corporations in the global north outsource their environmental harms through production networks to the global south. And empirically, if you look at just the time trend between inward foreign investment and CO2 emissions in developing countries, the time trend speaks for itself, I think. This is not suggestive of any kind of causal relationship. This is just looking at time trends. But if we actually estimate sophisticated regression models, we see that there is a statistically significant effect of inward foreign investment in manufacturing on growth in CO2 emissions in less developed countries. And if we look at a smaller sample of developed countries, the time trend is different. And if we do a regression analysis, we do not see a statistical relationship of that character. In the context of international trade, if we look at the effect of the percent of exports to more developed countries on per capita emissions for a sample of less developed countries, we do indeed see that it has a statistically significant non-trivial effect on growth in per capita emissions, and the magnitude of that effect gets bigger through time. Okay? So these two types of economic globalization contribute to some extent, we would argue, I would argue, and others would argue, to that slight increase in the carbon intensity of economic development within less developed countries. And more broadly, this is sort of characteristic of these types of environmental load displacements between the global north and the global south that take place through these types of economic globalization relationships. It's much more complicated than what I've quickly laid out here today, I realize that. So just a couple of key take-home points. This is my last slide. First of all, the shrinking gap in total CO2 emissions for developed countries and less developed countries is primarily due to growth of emissions in China and India. But there's something called the demographic trap, and this is a big conundrum because we place a lot of attention on the concern about the effects of population growth in developing nations on all sorts of environmental harms. Well, these nations are caught in a demographic trap. It's sort of tied to demographic transition theory and demography. In order for population growth to slow down, these nations need to be able to experience economic development, which is quite difficult to do for all sorts of global dynamics, historical dynamics, and domestic dynamics. If we look at per capita CO2 emissions, in 1960, CO2 emissions were 5 times larger on average in developed countries than in less developed countries. By 2005, this grew to 9 times larger. And this is a conservative estimate in developed countries and in less developed countries. Economic development has become slightly more carbon intensive in less developed countries, but overall it continues to be much more carbon intensive in developed countries. This is something that we just often overlook or just we don't hear about. Go figure. The effect of the world's militaries on greenhouse gas emissions is indeed non-trivial and far too overlooked. Far too overlooked. Well, I won't restate the economic globalization dynamics because I just sort of concluded by talking about this. So just more broadly, I just want to conclude by, I think, stating the obvious. The human causes and human consequences of climate change are largely rooted in various forms of global inequalities. Thank you.
We're going to hear from Gottlieb, who teaches international International Public Health here at the University of Utah and Westminster College.
Let's see. First thing I wanted to do is thank you all for the invitation. This is a little bit of an unusual audience for me. I usually speak to medical groups, and I wanted to thank Dean. This has sort of opened up a whole new way of thinking for me. I've been given a small task today. I'm supposed to talk about population, poverty, ecological destruction, and disasters. And I think I have 10 minutes to do this, plus summarizing what I think I heard from the other two folks. So let me at least tell you where I wanted to start. Dr. Jorgenson, if I heard this right, has basically said that I think we're underestimating the role that our own economic development plays on globalization of our economic globalization is playing on the carbon footprint as we're outsourcing the problems to India and China. With Dr. Murphy, I think she stated this pretty well. The question for us medically responding has been, oh my God, do something. Whereas what we should do is what we have always done, hopefully in the medical model. What ought we do? Do we continue with the existing framework, or do we try to take a better response than that? Well, for me, I've been a participant in programs over the last 30 years that I think may have contributed to unintended consequences. So the way I'd like to start this is to talk about unintended consequences. And in 10 minutes, we're going to do everything from the Marshall Plan to the current era. Okay. If we look at a traditional view of poverty, I recognize that it's no longer $1 a day. We've been inflated now to the $1.25 a day view. We have 1.2 billion people in the world currently at $1 a day, and 2.8 billion at $2 a day. One of the things that would predict poverty around the world tends to be, the things that correlate the most are the age of which a woman has her first child and literacy in women. Okay, those tend to be the most correlative. The $1 a day predicted malnutrition or food insecurity. I love the academic terms. This is starvation. Lack of shelter, increased disease burden, no access to basic health services. And when we looked at that initial 2.8 billion people at $2 a day, I also wanted people to be reminded that at the time we started the Marshall Plan in 1948, there were 2.8 billion people in the world. So now we have just as many people living in abject poverty as we did at the time the U.S. started formal development programs. When we look at poverty at $1 a day and $2 a day, why I wanted to point out the slide is this is statistics that have no real meaning. Basically, it doesn't tell you about distribution. I would suggest that of the 70% of sub-Saharan Africa that tends to be at absolute poverty, it tends to be pretty much everybody. Whereas if you go to South Asia, the rural population in South Asia is getting more and more poor. They are not participating in the development of India, and certainly China has been the most effective, though, in reducing poverty. In terms of the $1 a day or the $2 a day or whatever definition we want to use, I want to suggest it's also just a statistic. It really only matters as a goal of what can you get for that. If you can have adequate nutrition, medical care, access to education, human rights, gender equity, social justice, human capability, $1 a day may not necessarily be the bad thing. So it's an artificial measurement. So I want to look at one village. This is actually one house. We're going to look at these guys again later. Village in Nepal. This is one house. Their income has gone from less than $1 a day. We're now up to about $1.85 in the last 6 years. The village tended to be in a place that was caught between the Maoist conflict and a very inept king. Only 2 kids. Kids are going to school, plenty of food. We're going to talk a little more about what this has meant, but basically this is one example of the $2 a day measurement isn't an effective way to look at this. These are folks completely out of the economy. They have no income. They're doing great. So the $1 a day is not going to work. Here's a $4 a day group. This is a group of people in the Philippines living on a toxic waste dump. They're making $4 a day. They're working very hard. Kids can't quite go to school because they're also working. Here's some of the kids. Life expectancy on the dump, we think, is about 6 to 8 years. Hard to tell, but once you're on the dump, because of environmental exposures, toxic waste, industrial chemicals, leukemia, lead poisoning, heavy metal poisoning is very common. Housing is there, very definitely an intact community. These are the houses. They even have a little basketball court. So it's an intact community, $4 a day, but it doesn't address issues of dignity of the workplace, what is a living wage. Those issues aren't considered in those statistics of $1 or $2 a day. I put this in just simply because there's the myth, certainly in our country, that poor people are lazy. And I'm just going to say that's truly a myth. Oftentimes, this is how we look at it in terms of the development view. Give a man a fish, he's fed for a day. Teach a man to fish, he's fed for a life. Totally bogus. Okay, totally bogus. I think it is naive romanticizing about what we do in aid and why we fail at aid. I think it's naive. I don't think it's arrogant. I think it's naive. Because I don't think knowing how to fish is the problem. I think here's what the problems turn out to be. You have rivers. You can't access the river's polluted, there's no longer fish in the river's been dammed up, everything's been deforested, you can't get a boat. Once you catch the fish, you can't get the fish to market. Fishing rights have been granted via patronage to a different ethnic group. Once you get the fish to the market, there's nothing to exchange for. You're forced to sell the fish at less than a market living wage. So the knowledge to fish, I think, exists. I think it is a little bit condescending for us in aid and development to think all we have to do is give somebody a fishing line. I think it really refers far more to this. How do you politically give people power to organize, bargain collectively, prevent or revert the environmental degradation that's occurred? How do you stop corruption and misappropriation of resources? You may not have those skills. So what are some of the unintended consequences of what we do? That speaks to the first do no harm. Okay, we talked about this a little bit yesterday. I really like parasites, and I like history of development. It's just one of those weird things. I think DDT was a remarkably effective treatment when used appropriately. So in the 1940s, 1950s, when it was used in houses, not in the environment specifically, DDT stopped malaria, typhoid, dysentery. And you found that for the first time, we gave people modern birth rates with ancient death rates. We've uncoupled birth and death. Population just exploded. If you look at Sri Lanka, it was thought that within 10 years, at less than $1 a day, life expectancy went from a third world rate to the same life expectancy in America, at $1 a day in 10 years. And it's thought that 20% of the population in Sri Lanka, by 1965, 20% of the entire population was alive due to DDT. my God, there's people everywhere. What are we going to do? So we had Norman Borlaug come along with the Green Revolution. We could now produce more food, and people weren't going to starve. The unintended consequences of that were not the issues of production of food, but how to distribute food. That wasn't addressed. But the unintended consequences of the Green Revolution is now you had rural poor farmers who were tenant farmers lost their land. They were kicked off because it went to mechanization, or it required more food, more pesticides, more fertilizers. So people were displaced by machinery. And so by the 1970s, what we have are now the beginning of the urban slums. The urban slums, of course, led to spread of diseases like dengue and other such things. And this goes on and on. By the 70s, we decided, Vietnam War was bad, let's not deal with that anymore. We're not going to fight in other countries. We're going to arm insurgent groups and fight proxy wars. 2 minutes, okay, we're down to war, so we fight proxy wars, so now we've got Angola's problems in Iraq. Okay, let's get to the environment. 12 million people are dislocated each year from wars and natural disasters. This affects the poor, the disenfranchised, but again, someday refugees may be able to go home. What I'm going to say is, with the exception of last year, where New Zealand, the Christchurch earthquake, Tokyo, and Chile, every disaster I can think of for the last 30 years has been in the setting of political disruption, wars, economic inequities. I'm going to say most of the natural disasters, and I mean famines, everything, I don't think was necessarily purely a natural disaster. Same thing is occurring now under good things. We're building dams, we're trying to have cities come up with much better infrastructure, and we've dislocated 80 million people in the name of positive development. And I think the people who are most likely to be displaced tend to be the ethnic minorities. So this can be kind of a view of developmental cleansing instead of ethnic cleansing. And these are for good things. So for example, intact community, India needs water. They're not going to be able to get it in India. They need hydroelectric power. They're not going to get it in India. They're going to dam up rivers and streams upstream in Nepal. Villages are going to be dislocated. They're going to have nowhere to go. This is at 14,000 feet. You're not going to be able to move people upstream from this. So now we get to definitions. We don't know most of the time, I think, what we're really doing. We get very confused. We think we're doing acute disaster relief, acute disaster response when we're doing disaster relief. We think we're doing disaster relief when we're actually just doing ongoing development. For example, tsunami, Aceh in Indonesia. This is 2 to 3 months after the tsunami. I think I'm going to do an acute disaster response. You get there and you realize the people who are dead, the people who are still surviving. We're now doing rebuilding. It's now humanitarian aid. But yet, even now in Haiti, it's 2 years out, and we still think we're doing disaster response. If this, by the way, this is the one picture that is not mine, so I need to give credit. If we look at places like Darfur, the humanitarian crisis was a couple of years before people are now settled in camps. By the time you take nomadic people and you've put them in camps, first of all, it's a permanent issue, and the environmental degradation around those camps is such that they will never be able to reuse that land. So this is now a permanent problem. This is a Bhutanese refugee camp in Nepal. Third generation of people in a refugee camp. This is now a housing development. So this isn't relief work. This is just ongoing humanitarian aid and community building. So even when we try to do the right thing, clean water, basic human rights, most common cause of death in the third world, the developing world, gastroenteritis. So we build tube wells in the Bengal Plain. Great thing. Unintended consequences, highest arsenic concentrations in the world, so now we have a major global catastrophe that most folks don't know about. Cholera, we brought cholera to Haiti from Nepalese workers after this. So here's a simple solution to end on, and I want to show this as absolutely not meant to be prescriptive. This is simply one small project that worked in one small area. This is the back of that house in Nepal. This is called a biogas converter. We've gotten the cost down from $70 to $48. Basically, this is what it looks like. You take the animal dung, you take the human dung, you put it in there, it composts, methane comes out into the kitchen on the pipes, and you've got better fertilizer. Here's what comes from this simple thing. Okay, I came up with, just from the start, 13 things from this. You have improved crops because you have better fertilizer. You now have more food. If you have more food, you have better nutrition. If you have better nutrition, you have better ability to work. If you have better ability to work, you get a little more income. If you also have now improved water quality, which leads to less diarrhea, less parasites, less deforestation, because it's the people had to go up and hike up the hills to keep cutting down trees for the prior fuel. That leads to less intercommunity conflict. Now you have less labor requirements of the women and children. So the women, the girls can go to school. There's less lung and eye infections. And the final thing is you also have an intact ecosystem, which is more productive. So 12 minutes. Disasters, development, population. Sorry.
Okay, Susan, Fred, and Andrew, where's Andrew? Because we started a little late, we'll go to 10:40. And so we have time for open questions and discussion. And there's already somebody at the mic, sir.
Right. Well, I've got questions for everybody here. But let me just start with Professor Jorgenson. This general claim about environmental degradation, I think you are counting CO2 emissions as themselves environmental degradations, right? Because if you aren't, those graphs are incredibly implausible. I mean, the environment in North America, Canada, and the United States, as a result of all the industrial development, is tremendously better than it ever was. We live in a great environment for people. Now, if you think that CO2 emissions are themselves environmentally derogatory, you're just using the term in a funny way. So you have to be assuming that the CO2 emissions are somehow, in the end, going to lead to some kind of degradation. As, for example, Al Gore made himself infamous by talking about the melting of the Greenland ice cap, which would raise the sea level by 20 feet. Now, that would be a disaster, to be sure. What he didn't add was that at the present rate, as far as we know, it's going to take 600,000 years for it to melt. It ain't going to happen. Are all kinds of other disasters going to happen as a result of CO2? We don't know. They certainly aren't happening at the present time, and there's no reason to think they'll happen anywhere in the near future. So to count those as environmental degradations, it seems to me, skews your analysis to the point where it's essentially useless. It's so misleading.
Andrew?
I mean, really useless. I mean, I think the claim that that CO2 is itself degradation is a fallacy of an enormous kind. Wow. There's an empirical connection, if any, between that and genuine environmental degradation. And you are assuming, really, as a dogma, that this is going to happen without giving us any evidence that it will. I mean, I've read about the science.
Maybe we could let him answer.
A lot, and well, so.
in the spirit of collegiality, I'm just going to say I respectfully disagree with you. I respectfully disagree with what you're saying. If you'd like, I could take out CO2 emissions as a dependent variable and put in a direct measure of resource consumption, and my models would give the same findings. And I'm also, I'm making a big assumption that CO2 emissions is the key driver of climate change. So sure, if you're uncomfortable with that assumption, I respect that, but I respectfully disagree with you. And I think most folks that do the kind of work that I do would politely, respectfully disagree with you.
One way to think about this panel is in terms of the question of dirty hands, right? That you can't act without potentially also causing harm. And there's just a myriad harms, a number of harms that could happen. Another way to think of it is also to say that in acting, we have to look at the plank in our own eye first. Take out the plank, what's the expression? Take out the plank in our own eye before we turn to our neighbor. And I think that there's a sense which both those are right and both of those are wrong. But it does make me wonder what we can do now, right? And in very practical, concrete situations. So I wondered if the panelists might just, in the sort of prediction mode, or in the, if I could run the world, this is what I would want you to do mode, give us just a quick clip about what you want us to do. What action should we take in taking that plank out of our own eye and in helping others, trying as best as possible to avoid dirty hands?
Susan, why don't you take that one first?
Okay. Am I on here? Yeah. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Thanks, Sally. I think that's a fabulous question. I really do. If I ran the world, what would I do? I think one of the key things that I tried to communicate in my presentation is the need for us to think more critically and to reflect more critically on our actions, on the reach of our actions, and the outcomes of those actions. So I'm not suggesting, for example, that we should do less, but I am suggesting that we should think beyond the question of how much should we give, and think more broadly about our relationships with those near and dear, but also our relationships and the reach of our actions to those much more broadly. So I suppose very, very simply and perhaps somewhat idealistically, my main suggestion would be to engage in far more thoughtful action. So rather than just quick, which I have no doubt is necessary in certain circumstances, but to follow through on that and to see assistance not just as not out there on its own, but as part and parcel of how we live and how we engage with others more broadly. Thanks.
Andrew, do you have a comment?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic, difficult question to ask on a Friday morning. So I have a realistic response and I think an unrealistic response. And I think you were asking for a realistic response, but I have to do both. Yeah, pie in the sky, you know. Sociologists were always pie in the sky. So I think a realistic response would be, frankly, for the global north to really accept responsibility and actually really commit to funding adaptation strategies within the global south. We just really need to step up more than we have. And I think that's relatively realistic. I think, it's the relatively more realistic of the two. You know, I realize it's extraordinarily challenging and history proves that. Unrealistic, we need to rechange the normative thoughts about economic development. How much economic development do we really need? How much economic development does the global north really need? We need to focus more actually on income distributions within societies, which we're hearing a lot about in the US now with popular movements and so on. But we really need to think about that in the global north and focus on that rather than just growth in GDP per capita, but also realize the complexities of this within the global south, that they do need to be able to develop economically and to improve their quality of life. So I'll just leave it at that.
Fred?
Keeping this to healthcare, I think we're better off at least defining the problems better. Things, if we go to the root of the problems, we're better off. If we can define problems so we can get to the root of the issues, we may be better off. I mean, we hear about CNN daily talking about the impending famine in the Sahel area of Africa. We've known about this coming for a year and a half. We only respond when it gets on CNN. You know, that's the bigger thing, is you respond at the root cause, and that gets to political instability and corruption. On a smaller scale, I think when we're doing aid projects, I think they need to be driven locally. I don't think we can come in and tell people what they need. They have to tell us what they need and how they're going to go about it, and we assist them with that. On my pie in the sky, at least locally, well, we certainly need healthcare reform. I mean, you know, some of the issues in terms of public health, such as a migrant worker can't access the healthcare system with TB, and politically we think that's okay. It would be far more cost effective, not only to mention the humane thing to do is treat the person before it affects other folks. But that's very small. That's an easy thing to fix. We just don't have the political will to do that.
Thank you. I really appreciated all of the presentations. Thank you very much. I would like to make an observation and ask a question of all of you, really, about a cross-cutting theme, I think, in your presentations, which also applies to very much to all the philosophers here, and I'd very much invite them to also respond, which concerns the theory of decision-making under risk and uncertainty, where there are important moral considerations involved. It seems to me that the theory of rational decision-making under uncertainty, which is one of the crown jewels of economics, which economists like to point to as proof that they have done something useful, is more or less silent on this. I mean, or putting it another way, it's not relevant for most of the moral decision-making problems which we face. And that was, of course, recognized by the pioneers of such decision-making theory, that the axioms underlying expected utility theory, for instance, were not relevant in situations of life and death decision-making. Those axioms would not be plausible ones in those situations. Rather, they only apply to routine situations where there are not large stakes, and certainly not large stakes which have moral significance. And this is, of course, one of the arguments which Rawls gave in Justice as Fairness, a restatement for the plausibility of the particular solution that he derived in the original position, which is that a person acting as a trustee on behalf of others has very particular decision-making responsibilities, which should lead in the direction of much greater risk aversion, to use that slightly inappropriate term in this context, than would a person acting on his or her own behalf in a routine context. Now, it seems to me, based on my limited knowledge of moral philosophy, that the moral philosophers, as a general matter, and I would love to be corrected and educated on this, don't also have a proper theory in this regard, or at least a presentable off-the-shelf theory which can be digested and used as to how to deal with such situations. Not just, of course, where individuals' decisions on behalf of themselves are involved, but in particular, and this adds additional layers of difficulty, in social situations of the kind that all of you are discussing, in which there are interdependencies across persons and also spillovers from one decision-making realm to another, or one issue or issue area or thematic domain to another. So this is a wickedly complex problem and set of issues, empirically but also morally. The economists don't in fact have much to offer. This is my contention, or my first proposition. And I do not yet know what the moral philosophers have to offer, and I would like to know. Thank you.
Anyone?
Okay. Again, a very insightful and challenging question. I'm going to do my best to respond very briefly, and we'll happily take it up then afterwards, should you prefer. But I think I suppose there's a couple of different ways in which moral philosophers will engage in that process of reasoning. And I think that if we look, for example, I gave two examples. I looked at Singer and I looked at Sen, both of whom leading moral philosophers of our time. And Singer engaged in quite an abstract, idealized method of reasoning, assuming that we can actually extract ourselves and abstract ourselves, and then we follow through on a process of deduction and application. Zen, on the other hand, I think provides a framework for engaging in practical reasoning, which enables us to move from the situated context, so from the non-ideal circumstances that we find ourselves in, but also the situated context whereby we engage in evaluation and judgment. Now, the outcomes of those decisions may not be perfect. They may not be ideal. They are completely fallible. However, they do need to pass, or they do need to meet some sort of standards and requirements such that they can be found to be intersubjectively reasonable, at least. The other element of Zen's particular framework is that the outcomes of those decisions and the actions that we take based upon those decisions, we do retain responsibility for those outcomes. So if we find, for example, that the outcomes have led in a direction that we had not intended, we still have responsibility to go and to act. And so it's an ongoing process rather than a single strict decision-making procedure that will produce the right results always in each circumstance. I hope that goes some way towards explaining, but you can advise me of that. Thanks.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our panelists.